Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Hello, Karen.
Hey, Dan.
It is cold and it is snowy.
Yeah, I think pretty much everyone in the northern section of our listening area is facing some serious snow right now.
That, and I feel like the cold front is dipping pretty far south as well. So
Yeah, 20 has been kind of the highest.
a few years ago, it happened too. Like, they got freezing temperatures down there and those plants just aren't happy.
Yeah, it's not a good thing when freezing temperatures hit our southern farms because they're just not prepared for it like they are in the north because we just kind of stopped growing things because plants don't like cold, freezing weather. One of the things when you think about how plants grow, each of those cells is full of water. And then, water is one of those things where that solid is actually bigger and takes up more space. So the salt crystal forms, it expands and blows up that cell. And then that cell no longer has the ability to function properly. That's when your plants start getting wilty and it has to completely replace those cells. Those cells can't repair to fix the damage done by that freezing temperature. And so when we're trying to keep ice from forming on our sidewalks, we typically put down a salt mixture, right? And when we're putting down a salt mixture on the sidewalk, we're not actually melting the ice that's there. What we're doing is we're creating a situation wherein the ice has or the water has contaminants in it, which lower the freezing temperature of the water that's there.
Right. So what it essentially does is it prevents it from forming crystals, which is the solid state of water. And it's funny because water is one of the few elements in nature that when it turns into a solid, it actually expands. Most things contract as you make that transition, but water is one that will become less dense, crystallize, and float. Can you imagine if water did not expand and become less dense and it's just sunk and sunk and sunk? Then we wouldn't have any life in the sea, I wouldn't think, right? Because it would just be crushed as ice forms.
Yeah, I never thought about it from that perspective. That's an interesting consideration. Yeah, those ice sheets that are insulating the oceans would just not be there. They'd be on the bottom. And yeah, I never really considered that, but you're right.
Mm-hmm. I remember a professor taught me that, and I thought it was quite interesting. I'm glad you think so as well. So I'll keep talking about it.
Oh, those crazy professors, right?
Yeah. So Karen, you're right. We say salts. It's a very generic term, meaning that you have a cation and an anion, which means a positive and negative charge. A lot of things are distributed this way. It's typically a solid. It typically dissolves in water. Our fertilizers are typically in salt forms. We put salt in our food, which is sodium chloride.
That's true.
And salt, like you were saying, it prevents the water from crystallizing at freezing temperatures. And there's different types of salts that work in different temperature ranges, but they also have effects on things like concrete and metal. So it's something else to consider, and plants, right?
Right. And so let's talk a little bit about different salts because not all salt that you buy for your sidewalks is the same thing.
And depending on what the temperature is, what your budget is as well, because price is a factor in just about everything we do, if not everything.
This is true.
So you have to make a decision based on not only the temperature, but maybe your threshold for damage, but also the budget that you have. And if it gets too cold, unfortunately, the salt is not going to keep it from crystallizing and forming ice.
Yeah, I think the de-icing chemicals that we have will prevent the water from freezing down to about 15. And so if you're below 15, you're still going to have ice regardless. So
yeah, sodium chloride will stop working at 18 degrees. I think that one is probably the cheapest one.
Yeah. For those of you in those colder sections of our listening area, please keep that in mind that just because they've put out de-icing salts on the roads, ice can still form over top of those de-icing salts.
That's right. And in fact, I think what you're referring to now is magnesium chloride, which has a working temperature, minimum working temperature of negative 13 Fahrenheit, according to this chart that I'm looking at. It's a very fast acting, and it actually does not damage concrete and metal, according to this. And it's moderately harmful to plants. So at negative 13, this will work. If temperatures fall below negative 13, calcium chloride is your best option. So calcium chloride will work at temperatures at negative 22. It's also fast acting, but it does damage concrete and metal. And I think calcium chloride is probably one of the cheaper forms of deicers that we use. And it can be overused. So when you are putting salt down on your steps and your concrete or alongside your house, even be aware that over salting with sodium chloride can cause damage.
Right.
Yeah, there's so many products. No wonder we have a show on this. So calcium chloride is not sodium chloride. Sodium chloride is table salt.
Right. And well, yes, but what you're putting on your sidewalks isn't table salt. Table salt's been refined and typically has iodine added so it can keep your thyroid healthy and things like that. But rock salt is what we'll put on the ground, and that is pretty much the most used form of de-icer, but it's also the most harmful to plants because it does have high chloride levels. And sometimes it can also have an anti-caking agent in it that's made of cyanide. So, again, another thing we don't particularly want to play with. So, rock salt, while it's cheap, may not be the best. Another option is calcium chloride. It's a little bit better than rock salt because it doesn't contain cyanide, but it can also harm plants if it's at high enough concentration. So, more expensive, but you don't need to use as much. So, while you're paying more for it, you should be using a whole lot less than rock salt.
Yeah.
Another option is magnesium chloride, and it's considered the least toxic de-icing salt because it contains less chloride than either rock salt or calcium chloride. So it's going to be safer for plants and for animals, but it does have some chloride in it. And when that builds up because you're using too much of it, then it can still cause issues. And then there's calcium magnesium acetate, or CMA. It is less toxic than de-icers that contain chloride, but again, it's going to be more expensive. So there's options out there, and you have to make the one that's the best one for you. But like Dan was saying, cost is often an issue, but don't be put off by those higher expenses up front, because typically the more expensive ones, you're going to make up the cost in the fact that you don't have to use as much to get the same end goal. Now, if you're one of those people that just gets their lawn seed spreader out, fills it with salt, and walks down the sidewalk, you want to get the least toxic one you can.
'Cause that's just going to go everywhere. Those things are broadcasters.
Right. And it's not the best option. So stop doing that for one.
Yeah, unless unless you have a very, very wide driveway, I guess.
Yeah,
But
maybe.
remember, yeah, this stuff is going to kill your grass. It's going to kill your plants. We talk about salt contamination, salt buildup in soils and stuff, and it requires a lot of rain. And when you're using salt to melt ice, the levels are very, very high. So it takes a long time to dissipate. So keep that in mind. Just because we're getting a lot of snow doesn't mean that salt will dissipate very well. And it doesn't mean that it won't kill your plants. They're not dead in the wintertime. They're just very, very low. They have a very low metabolism.
Right.
You said it before. The roots tend to keep going as they can. So on warmer days in the wintertime, the roots are absorbing things. And if they start absorbing the salts, it's going to cause a lot of damage. Salts can kill trees. We see that in cities, and that's why we have salt tolerant tree species that do a little bit better because of this.
Right. Yeah. And salt is a huge issue with urban tree plantings because a lot of times what we do is we'll put trees in those lower parts of the landscape. And then when the snow melts, containing all of the salt we've been spreading on our roads and our sidewalks all that snow is going to run down into that low point. And while that soil can help filter out some of that salt before it gets into our waterways, which is another huge issue, that salt will build up to a point where it does become toxic. And if you drive along the interstate, you can see in those low lying areas off to the side of the interstate, there'll often be some really gnarly looking trees, and that is an effect from the salts that the branching structure doesn't work right. They get what are called witches' brooms because the salt gets up into the circulatory system of the tree and it deforms the cells and doesn't allow them to transmit the nutrients that it needs to transmit, and eventually it can kill those trees. So it's really important to be as sparing as possible when you are applying salt.
Yeah.
So you want to scatter your salt with 3 inches between every grain. So if you think about that, that's not a lot.
Right. You don't want to use salt for traction. If you are stepping and it feels like you're walking on a gravel road because of the salt, that's way too much.
Yes.
And that's kind of a waste of money. And that's very harmful to plants. And the salt's going to build up and you're not going to get rid of it for a long, long time. So things to consider. If you put a little bit of salt down, you're still not satisfied, you still want more traction. Think about that. You can use traction, you can use sand, you can use ashes, you can use kitty litter. Hopefully,
Mhm.
not used kitty litter.
Hey, but if it's all you got, it's all you got.
That's right. That's right. If it's all you got, it's all you got. It's
But we do recommend you don't use the clumping cat litter for traction. You want to use the good old fashioned cheap stuff because it's just particles of clay. So get the cheapest kitty litter you can, or just get a bag of, take that playground sand that your kid used in
mhm.
the sandbox last year and scoop that out. And that way you can put fresh sand in it next year.
Yeah, and a little bit of sand that gets washed off into your grass isn't a bad thing. So that's not a bad thing to have.
Now, if you want to be really crazy, another thing you can use for traction is birdseed. Right? So it does have a texture to it, right? You are going to crush it when you walk on it, but for some birds, that's very helpful because it opens up that grain as long as they're going to come quickly. And but that could be an option. And then the birds are going to get on your sidewalk and dig out those seeds and again spread that snow out. Their body temperature is going to be down there warming it up. So that's another potential option. And now do not use bird seed if you're also using salt. So you don't wanna use those 2 things together.
And I guess we're talking about price of things, right? So there might be some good liquidation prices on bird seed right now, but I
Or
still
if
don't
you
think
just
it's
have
the
a
most.
stash.
I don't think it's the most economical.
It's
But
definitely not.
so speaking of bird seed, wow, what a way to transition. What we wanted to highlight in today's show is the highly pathogenic avian influenza. It's been on the news quite a bit last year, but it is something that has caught our attention. It also caught Ohio Department of Agriculture's attention. And I'm sure on the West Virginia side, Karen, people are talking about it too. They're watching it now, and it's something that we do have to watch every year.
Yeah, and for those of us who are in our local area, there was a positive detection in southern West Virginia in Pocahontas County. It's been taken care of. They have gone in and disinfected that area, but it's January and it's already starting to show up. So it is critical if you're going to buy bird seed for your chickens that you follow good biosecurity practices.
Yeah, and why is it when we talk about the bird flu, or some people call it highly pathogenic avian influenza, which is a subcategory of the bird flu? Why is it that sometimes it's bad, sometimes it doesn't seem to be a big deal? Sometimes it affects humans, sometimes it affects other animals, right? We saw the bird flu cases with the dairy as well. A lot of that has been controlled, so that's a good thing. But why is it that bird flu has so many it's so across the board as far as severity, species? One of the reasons, when you look at the name of a bird flu, like a typical one is H1N1. So you got those two letters, H and N, which are both two types of proteins. One is actually called, the H is the hemagglutinin, and the N is the neuraminidase, and that's as far as I'm going to go into that. But here's what happens. You have 18 types of H and you got 11 types of N, and you got combinations. Different combinations will affect different species. They will have different severities. Some of those combinations will also affect humans, some won't. Some will be very detrimental to poultry, some will not. It happens every year, and it's a little bit random as far. I'm sure there are predictors, but because they do predict as they start identifying strains, they can figure out which one is going to be more pathogenic or not. So there is that, but there's just so much variability in the bird flu, and it's because of that. It's one of those viruses that just has a lot of recombination potentials, and
Right.
that just means variation.
Yeah, and you think about how things change and evolve. It's all a process of mutation. And so as these microorganisms mutate, sometimes we have different impacts from them. Now, we have been able to isolate which ones that we know of are more impactful, and we work towards making sure that we prevent those more impactful ones from spreading. And so that's where you come in as a producer. If you have chickens, even if you only have two chickens in your backyard, you are a producer and you are involved with preventing the spread of the highly pathogenic avian influenza.
Yeah. So one of the things that you're talking about, Karen, is as as we look at these different strains, and they're obviously carried by birds most of the time. It's nature's hardly ever 100%. We talk about this all the time, but
Right.
there's really four major migration patterns where these wild birds, I don't know if they're just geese or if they're whatever.
A lot of different waterfowl carry it without being symptomatic.
Yeah, well, that's true too. So it is important to note that somehow waterfowl like ducks and geese are more, they're more resistant than our domesticated agricultural birds. So I guess in that sense it makes sense, because most agricultural crops are a little bit more sensitive to disease than their wild relatives. But there are four major migration patterns for wild birds that we see across the United States. The one that we see will come down from Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, right through West Virginia. It's also joined by another migratory pattern that goes from New York to Pennsylvania and then down through the Northeast. It all kind of comes together in Virginia and works its way down through Florida, mainly along the coast. But there is another track of the same migration pattern, same type of birds that will go through Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi. There is a central, like Midwest pattern that'll just kind of go down. It still does a little bit of Wisconsin, but it has Illinois and North and South Dakota, and it goes down through Louisiana. And then there's two more going west to the mountain states and then through the West Coast. So those migration patterns are really important because of what Karen said. So you have these waterfowl from Canada, right? Because that's kind of where the ones that are coming through the U.S. are probably going through Canada. I don't see any other routes possible.
Yeah, they're going to go over land because that's where food
Yeah.
is, right?
So they're coming down from the north and they're working their way south. But as they carry these diseases that they're typically resistant to, and they start commingling with your domesticated fowl, they will infect them. And then, depending on the strain, right? Sometimes they're very severe, and they can wipe out flock houses of tens of thousands of birds. And sometimes they are just your backyard chickens that will all of a sudden die. They typically have a lot of discharge. There's a lot of symptoms you can look for, and you want, if that happens, it's a lot of times ODA extension. I'm sure West Virginia Department of Agriculture as well. They're looking at that, and they want to test these birds so they can start tracking what kind of variation of the bird flu that it is. Remember the H and the N,
Mhm.
and they have different consequences for different species. In fact, one of the things that we kind of skipped over was there are four major types: influenza A, which will affect a wide range of animals, including birds. B will mainly infect humans. C will infect humans, pigs, and more rare than types of A and B. So typically we see A and B. And then D is on cattle. So I'm assuming now that when we talked about the bird flu cases in dairy, that was probably influenza D. And it was kind of uncommon to have a human effect, but it could.
Now, when we're talking about the highly pathogenic avian influenza, we're talking about an influenza type A. But there's also the highly pathogenic, and then there's the low pathogenicity avian influenza. So when you're looking at your birds, and let's say that they're having some respiratory distress, a lack of energy, a lack of appetite, maybe decreased egg production that's not connected to shorter winter days, and maybe some diarrhea, that could be low pathogenicity avian influenza. And we're less concerned about that. But when you start having your birds have sudden death without any prior symptoms of illness, or you may have some soft shelled and misshapen eggs that go along with a decreased egg production, swelling in the eyelids, the comb, the wattles, the shanks, purple discoloration in the wattles and comb and legs. And then again, you've got the respiratory distress symptoms. And if they twist their head and their neck and they're just like kind of standing in a weird position, again, that is another thing to look for. When you start seeing those symptoms, you need to call your veterinarian and or the Department of Agriculture and let them know. Even if you only have two birds, you're like, oh, it's not a big deal. If it's in your yard, it might be in your neighbor's yard or the producer down the street. We need to know where it is so that we can keep it from spreading, so that we can maintain security in our food system.
Yeah. So call the Department of Ag, call us, call your extension office. Your extension office will also be aware or at least figure out the information for you whether ODA or your corresponding Department of Agriculture is tracking the strains that are causing the harm, that the symptoms that you're seeing for the bird flu. Sometimes it can cause instant death. Sometimes it just makes the animal sick for a while. Like Karen was saying, there's different severities. Sometimes the Department of Ags are going to be more aggressive than others. So call them, call us, and the extension offices. We can help you out.
And if you can't get a hold of someone at the extension office, the Department of Ag is a good number to call. In West Virginia, we're actually asking people to contact Department of Ag first because they have staff on hand that are able to go out to the farm and do the blood testing to see what's going on with those birds. Whereas an extension, we're just an informational resource. So for us, we're going to ask that you contact the West Virginia Department of Agriculture first if you see these symptoms in your birds.
Yeah. So, and some of the things that you can do, right? So the virus is actually, it's going to be in the fecal matter. It's going to be in the feed. It's going to be on the birds themselves. So sometimes just the fact that you are going in there to take care of your birds, if you're walking through a lot of goose poop, right? If you're walking through a lot of feathers, say you have a pond and you have a high instance of waterfowl around and you have to walk through that, or you don't change your shoes when you go into the chicken pen or the chicken coop or whatever, you could be tracking those viruses in there and infecting the poultry that you have. So be aware of that. Some of the things you can do: have a disinfectant bath as you go in and out of a facility, whether it's just a pen or whether it's a coop or whether it's something larger.
Now, we're not asking you to spray yourself down with a hose like you're going into prison and you need to get rid of lice. We're just talking about walk through a disinfectant with
That's
your
yeah,
shoes.
that's a different show altogether. Or just have like designated shoes for that facility.
Yes.
If you have enough chickens and you have layers, and it makes sense to just leave a pair of boots right there that you can change out of your street shoes into that and go in and out, so that the only kind of poop on those shoes is poop that came from within the coop. Well, guess what? If it's the virus isn't there, it's not going to get there through your shoes.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, just keep that stuff in mind and keep your ear open for cases of bird flu. And as you hear about it, start taking action to prevent it from affecting your poultry.
Right. And so there's a lot of little steps you can take. And the first one that I want to recommend to you is going to the USDA's site called Defend Your Flock. Once you're there, there's a lot of different steps to help you reduce attracting potential wildlife carrying avian influenza. It'll talk you through basic biosecurity steps, both in a structural way for, adjusting the physical construction of your coop and your farm, and for operational, meaning what you do as a farmer. And so practices, procedures, policies, things like that. So there's two different levels of biosecurity steps that you should be taking as an agricultural producer, and that includes the backyard chickens that only have like two chickens. Okay. You need to do your part to protect all of our poultry operations throughout our country. And so, just to review, if you start to see your birds dropping and you don't know what's going on, call the vet, call the Department of Agriculture and just say, hey, I don't know what's happening, or I do know what's happening. I've seen these symptoms. Let them come and check out your flock. It's really important to reduce the amount of inoculum out there so that we can keep the spread of the highly pathogenic version out of the landscape.
And just kind of think about how that virus gets to your flock. If you see a dead bird over by the pond and you pick it up to throw it out or to bury it, or you're still being around that bird, you don't know how that bird died. If it did die from highly pathogenic avian influenza, you mess with it, it's not necessarily going to make you sick, even though it could, depending on the strain, right? But if it killed a wild waterfowl and you track that virus that into your flock, it's going to wipe out your flock almost certainly. So be aware of that stuff. Watch for goose poop. If you're tracking through goose poop to get to your coop, you're in a very dangerous situation. So just be aware of how it got there and ways to keep it out.
Exactly. And, think about your water resources, protect the water resources from salt from your driveway, and make sure that you're not using water resources where wildlife or wildfowl habitually go as a water source for your flock, because again, it can go through that water system. So protect your waters, find out more, ask questions, and do your part to protect the wildlife and to protect your farm. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.